Black flight attendant is humiliated by a wealthy doctor during a flight simply because of the color of her skin, and the pilot's decision leaves everyone shocked. Ava Thompson adjusted her navy blue blazer with practiced precision, smoothing the gold-striped cuffs and aligning the silver wings pinned to her chest. She always took an extra second before stepping out into the cabin. It was her ritual, the one moment of calm before the hum of passengers, the clinking of service carts, and the gentle turbulence of altitude became her reality. At 32 years old, Ava had been flying for 8 years. She knew every protocol, every smile that hid exhaustion, every small act that made a stranger's day better, and she was proud of it. She had grown up in a modest home in southwest Atlanta, raised by her grandmother and older brother after their parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Life had taught her early about resilience. She chose to work in the skies, not for the glamour, which had long since faded from public perception, but for the sense of order, the independence, the chance to move freely above the chaos of the world below. This morning she was scheduled for Flight 227, a non-stop from New York's JFK to San Diego. The crew briefing was uneventful, led by Captain Brian Carter, a seasoned pilot in his 50s with silver hair and a calm demeanor. He greeted Ava warmly. They had worked together many times before. "Same old route, huh?" he said, sipping coffee. "Just the way I like it," she replied with a soft laugh. The rest of the crew was equally familiar. Jake Miller, the first officer, had a boyish charm and an engineer's brain. 2 other flight attendants, Naomi and Lucas, rounded out the team, both reliable, both professional. Boarding was smooth. First class filled with the usual mix of executives and frequent flyers. Coach was bustling, but Ava had long since learned how to manage the waves of passengers with a graceful efficiency that made it all look effortless. As she walked the aisle, assisting passengers, helping with overhead bins, answering questions about connections and meal preferences, she felt grounded in her role. She noticed the man in seat 2A only in passing at first, a sharply dressed individual in a tailored charcoal suit, browsing something on a tablet with a practiced disinterest in the world around him. There was nothing unusual, not yet. The plane took off on schedule just after 9 o'clock in the morning. The engines roared, the city below shrank, and the clouds welcomed them. The seatbelt signs blinked off after 10 minutes, and the crew moved into action. Ava rolled the beverage cart into first class, checking her tablet for special requests. As always, she began with a warm greeting. "Good morning, sir. Can I offer you a beverage?" The man in 2A glanced at her, his gaze lingering just a second. Too long, his expression unreadable. "Red wine, room temperature, not whatever cheap thing you usually serve," he said. She nodded, brushing past the tone. "Of course, we have a Cabernet Sauvignon that pairs nicely with the lunch service. I'll pour that for you now." She turned, unshaken. Passengers had moods, she had a job, but something in his tone, something about the way his eyes followed her, left a small unease in the pit of her stomach. Still, she served the wine with her usual smile, placed the glass gently on the tray table, and moved on to the next seat. After completing the first-class service, Ava stepped into the galley to refresh the cart. Lucas caught her eye. "Guy in 2A seems intense," he said under his breath. Ava shrugged lightly. Just another suit with too much ego. But as she walked past him again, she heard it, low, almost under his breath, but just clear enough. "Pity. They're giving anyone jobs these days, huh?" She stopped briefly, almost imperceptibly, then kept walking. Professionalism. Grace under pressure, that was the mantra, let it go. Yet it stayed with her, the way his words lingered like smoke. Not the content, she'd heard worse, but the deliberate ease with which he said it, like it was natural, expected, a truth he didn't think twice about sharing aloud. By the time lunch service began, Ava's smile was a little more guarded. She kept her distance from 2A except when necessary. But she noticed things. The way he handed back the menu like it was contaminated, how he tapped his finger on his water glass when he wanted a refill, how he never said please or thank you, only orders, crisp, cold, devoid of acknowledgement. Still, she performed every task with the same care, not just because she had to, but because it was who she was. 2 hours into the flight, she leaned against the rear galley counter, sipping water, when Naomi joined her. "He's watching you." "Ava, like, constantly." Ava blinked. "Yeah, I noticed." "You okay?" "Fine, it's not the first time." But something in her voice betrayed her. She wasn't fine, not completely. Because this wasn't just rudeness. It wasn't just entitlement. It was laced with something else, and something darker, older, sharper. She checked the time, still over 3 hours to go before San Diego, and the air in the cabin was beginning to shift subtly, slowly, like a pressure change before a storm. Ava stood straighter, adjusted her uniform again, and prepared to re-enter the aisle. Professionalism, grace, control. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was about to test every ounce of it. There was a calculated elegance to Dr. Charles Whitaker that seemed almost theatrical. Everything about him, from his perfectly pressed suit to the way he sipped his wine, projected wealth, confidence, and authority. He sat in seat 2A like it was a throne, legs crossed, expression unreadable, his eyes moving across the cabin not with curiosity, but with judgment. To anyone unfamiliar, he would look like just another high-paying passenger, distinguished, perhaps demanding, but within the bounds of normal. But Ava could feel it. Something was off. His presence carried weight, not because of who he was, but because of how deliberately he used it to unsettle. She noticed it first when she returned to check if he was comfortable. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Dr. Whitaker?" she asked with the same calm tone she used for every guest. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at her name tag, then at her face, and finally back to his glass of wine. "I suppose it's acceptable," he said without looking at her. Then came the pause, a beat too long, a silence that wasn't just idle, but filled with intention. And then he added casually, "At least you people are finding employment again. It's good for the country, I guess." It was not the words alone, but the way he said them, slow, deliberate, like a challenge. He didn't look at her for a reaction. He didn't need to. The message had already landed. Ava stood there for a second, searching for the right reply. Something professional, measured, not reactive, but sometimes silence says more than words. She gave a tight nod and walked away, heart suddenly heavier. She returned to the galley, jaw tight. Lucas looked up from the tray he was sorting and caught her expression. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said too quickly. "Just long flight." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. There was a code among flight attendants. They knew when not to push, when to step in, and when to wait. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere began to shift. Dr. Whitaker started pressing the call button more frequently. At first, it was for minor requests, an extra napkin, a different wine glass, his seat adjusted by just a fraction. Nothing overtly hostile, but the frequency was enough to draw attention. And each time Ava approached, there was a new comment, a new gesture designed to irritate, to belittle. When she handed him a hot towel, he let it fall intentionally onto the floor, then looked at her without emotion. "Pick that up, would you?" he said, as if speaking to a servant, not a trained professional thousands of feet in the air. She bent down, picked it up silently, and placed it on his tray table again without a word. Later, he asked for a different brand of sparkling water, though the airline only stocked one. When Ava politely informed him of that, he let out a theatrical sigh. "Of course, I forgot I wasn't on an international flight," he said, loud enough for those around him to hear. "Standards are different here." Passengers nearby were beginning to glance over. Ava noticed a woman in 2C give her a sympathetic look, while the man in 1D narrowed his eyes at the exchange. But no one said anything. Not yet. Dr. Whitaker continued to escalate. When she offered him his lunch, the same gourmet selection, served to all first-class passengers, he leaned back, arms crossed. "I'd prefer someone else serve me," he said. "No offense, but I'd feel more comfortable that way." Ava froze for a second. "I assure you, sir, the service and meals are the same for all passengers, regardless of who serves them." "I'm not questioning the service. I'm questioning the fit," he said, eyes locking onto hers, daring her to react. It wasn't just about her performance. It was about her presence, Her existence in that uniform, in that cabin, serving someone like him, that was the offense. Ava swallowed hard and stepped away, her hands shaking slightly though her face remained composed. Back in the galley, she took a moment to breathe, but her mind was racing. Every insult, every microaggression, every smug look he gave her was calculated to provoke, to degrade without ever crossing the blurry line that would make intervention mandatory. It was the kind of discrimination that hid behind veiled comments and plausible deniability. Lucas, who had overheard part of the last interaction, walked over. He said he wanted someone else to serve him. He did. I know. They stood in silence for a beat. The hum of the aircraft was constant, but Ava's pulse was louder in her ears. "I can take over his section if you want," Lucas offered gently. "No," Ava said. "That's what he wants, and I won't give him the satisfaction." She returned to the cabin and continued her duties, avoiding 2A as much as possible, but she could still feel his eyes on her. Every time she passed, she sensed it. The scrutiny, the malice, the tension was thickening, noticeable now, not just to the crew but to the passengers around him. He had moved from subtle jabs to overt dismissiveness. When Ava offered a refill to the woman in 2C, he interrupted. "Do you train for this?" he asked loudly. "Or is it one of those inclusive hiring efforts?" Ava turned to him, lips pressed together. "I beg your pardon, sir." He raised his hands slightly as if in mock defense. "Just asking. It's important to know who's handling things when you're flying at 35,000 feet. The woman in 2C, clearly uncomfortable now, looked at Ava with alarm. "You don't have to answer that," she said firmly, then turned to Dr. Whitaker. "She's doing an excellent job. You're the only one complaining." A few heads turned. A man in 3A leaned slightly forward, sensing the growing conflict. Dr. Whitaker chuckled, eyes never leaving Ava. "Touchy, aren't we?" Ava didn't respond. She turned and walked back toward the galley. This time her breath was uneven. Her fingers trembled as she poured water for another passenger. The professionalism that had been her armor was beginning to crack, not because she couldn't handle rudeness, but because she wasn't just being mistreated. She was being targeted, dehumanized. And still, she had a job to do. Still, she had hours left in this flight. Still, she had to wear the uniform with pride, even as someone tried to strip that pride away word by word. But something inside her was beginning to shift. Not just the usual resolve, not just endurance, something deeper, a quiet, simmering refusal to be diminished. The cabin of Flight 227 had taken on a peculiar quiet, the kind that wasn't due to turbulence or fatigue, but something else, something unspoken. It hung in the air like an electrical charge, invisible but present. Ava moved through it with professional poise, attending to other passengers while deliberately avoiding seat 2A. But avoidance could only go so far in the confined dimensions of an aircraft. Charles Whitaker was not a man who tolerated being ignored, and he had made up his mind that this flight would become a stage for his disdain. Less than 30 minutes after his last degrading remark, the chime of his call button rang again. Ava, standing in the galley with her colleagues, took a breath and started toward him. Lucas looked at her, concerned, but she shook her head. She needed to handle this herself, not because of pride, though there was some of that, but because she wouldn't let him think she was afraid. She approached seat 2A with the same neutral expression she had mastered over years of practice. "Oh yes, Dr. Whitaker." He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he held out his glass, half full with the wine she had poured earlier. "I'd like another. And this time, make sure it's properly aerated." Ava took the glass without comment, turned and returned a minute later with a fresh pour. She placed it gently on his tray, but as she was pulling away, he spoke again. "Tell me something," he said, voice low but pointed. "Do they teach you how to fake that smile in training? Or is it just something that comes naturally?" She straightened slightly, refusing to let her irritation show. "We're trained to maintain a professional demeanor under all circumstances, sir." He replied, swirling the wine slowly. "I imagine it takes quite a bit of effort to look composed when you're in the wrong place." That line hung in the air like a dagger. For a split second, Ava felt her breath hitch, the heat rising in her chest, But before she could respond, he added, "It's not a personal insult, mind you. I just believe everyone should know where they belong. It helps maintain order, don't you think?" Ava didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, her step steady, but her heart pounding. She reached the galley, hands clenched by her sides. Lucas and Naomi both looked up, sensing the shift. "Okay, this is more than just rude now," Naomi said, stepping forward. "He's targeting you." "He's trying to break me," Ava replied almost to herself, "piece by piece." Lucas set down a tray. "Then maybe it's time someone stepped in." "No," she said, sharper than she intended, then softening, "Not yet." She returned to her duties, though her interactions with other passengers now carried a different tone, a tension that others began to notice. Passengers who had seen the exchange began whispering. Eyes followed Ava as she passed. There was sympathy in some glances, discomfort in others. But no one intervened. Not yet. Dr. Whittaker, meanwhile, had begun performing for an audience. Each comment, each pointed remark, was now loud enough to be heard by more than just Ava. When she passed by with a cart of snacks, he asked loudly, "No caviar on board? I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Standards have fallen since the days when airlines hired actual professionals." Ava didn't stop. She didn't even glance in his direction. But behind her, murmurs grew. The woman in seat 2C, who had earlier defended Ava, leaned across the aisle. "You know, maybe if you treated people with respect, you'd get better service." Dr. Whittaker turned to her with a smug smile. "I don't recall speaking to you." "You don't have to," the woman snapped. "Your behavior speaks volumes." Ava, hearing the exchange, turned back toward the row, hands still gripping the cart. "It's okay, ma'am," she said firmly. "Let's not escalate this." But Dr. Whittaker wasn't done. He smirked at Ava. "See, she's used to it. That's what makes her a good employee." The words stung. Not because they were cruel, though they were, but because they carried an assumption that her silence meant acceptance, that her professionalism was submission. She returned to the galley and placed both hands on the counter, breathing slowly. She was starting to unravel, not in a way visible to others, not yet, but inside, the storm was growing. Years of restraint, of swallowing small offenses, were reaching their limit. Jake Miller appeared at the curtain separating the cockpit from the cabin. His expression changed the moment he saw her face. He stepped into the galley, lowering his voice. "Ava, what's going on?" She shook her head. "It's fine." "No, it's not. You're pale and your hands are shaking." She looked at him, then at Naomi and Lucas. There was nowhere to hide now. "It's the man in 2A, she said. She paused. "He's been making personal comments about my ability, about where I belong." Jake's jaw tightened. "Have you told the captain?" "No, I didn't want to cause trouble." Jake stared at her for a moment, then pulled out his phone and walked back toward the cockpit. Ava didn't stop him this time. Moments later, the captain's voice came through the intercom with a standard announcement about turbulence. But inside the cockpit, Brian Carter was getting the full story. He listened in silence, then stood, nodding once. "He's still in 2A?" Jake nodded. The captain looked at him. "I'll handle it." Back in the cabin, the atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was heavy, like something was about to happen. And Ava, standing near the galley door, felt it too. The moment was approaching where professionalism alone wouldn't be enough. She closed her eyes for a second, steadying herself. The flight wasn't over, but something had changed. The line had been crossed, and whether she liked it or not, this man had turned her workplace into a battlefield. But if he expected her to retreat, to crumble, to let him walk away unchallenged, he was about to be disappointed. Captain Brian Carter didn't leave the cockpit often mid-flight unless there was a technical issue or a serious concern involving a passenger. But when Jake returned and quietly relayed what had been happening in first class, something in Brian's expression changed. He had flown with Ava many times over the years. She was composed, intelligent, and deeply professional, not someone prone to exaggeration or overreaction. If she was shaken, it meant something truly troubling was occurring. And if there was one thing Brian Carter believed above all else, it was that every member of his crew deserved to be treated with respect. He waited until the flight had leveled. again adjusted his uniform, and stepped out of the cockpit with calm authority. Jake remained inside, monitoring the instruments, while Brian made his way through the business section and into first class. Every head turned slightly when the captain entered the cabin, not because of turbulence, but because his presence outside the cockpit always signaled that something was wrong. Dr. Charles Whitaker was reclined in his seat, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up as the captain approached. Ava, who had just exited the galley and was preparing to check on passengers, froze when she saw Brian move toward 2A. Her heart thudded in her chest. She didn't want to become the center of attention, and yet part of her had silently wished someone would finally intervene. Brian stopped beside 2A and addressed the passenger with a firm but measured voice. "Dr. Whitaker, I'm Captain Brian. Carter in command of this flight. I need to speak with you." The doctor looked up slowly, his expression cool. "Is there a problem, Captain?" "I believe there is. Would you please follow me to the rear of the aircraft?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "To the back? I don't believe that's necessary. I've paid for this seat and I'm quite comfortable here." Brian's tone didn't change. "It wasn't a request, sir. I need to speak with you privately now." There was a long pause. Passengers in the surrounding seats looked on with increasing interest. Ava stood motionless, watching as a shift occurred, the first real shift, in the power dynamic that had defined the flight so far. Dr. Whitaker exhaled slowly, clearly weighing his options. Then, with exaggerated care, he removed his seatbelt and rose to his feet. He stood, tall, shoulders back, but there was a tension in his posture now, something uneasy beneath the arrogance. As the captain led him through the aisle, all eyes followed. Some passengers leaned slightly to see better. Others simply stared, stunned that someone had finally challenged the man whose toxic presence had contaminated the cabin for hours. Once they reached the back of the plane, Brian motioned for him to wait near the rear galley, where Lucas and Naomi quickly stepped aside. Ava stayed where she was, not moving closer, but listening carefully. The captain folded his arms. "Dr. Whitaker, I've been informed of several inappropriate comments you've made toward a member of my crew." Charles scoffed. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't touched anyone. Are we now policing tone and opinion on commercial flights?" "You're not being questioned for your volume," Brian said, his voice unwavering. "You're being spoken to because your behavior is disruptive, disrespectful, and discriminatory. And that is unacceptable on any flight under my command." Dr. Whitaker laughed, but it was hollow. "I see, so this is about feelings now. This is about conduct," the captain said flatly. "You are not entitled to belittle or demean the crew who ensure your safety and comfort at 35,000 feet. If you continue with this behavior, I will report the incident to federal authorities and have you escorted from the aircraft upon landing." That made Charles's smirk falter. He was used to winning with words, with intimidation, with the sheer force of status. But this man in front of him wasn't playing along. "I'll return to my seat then," he said stiffly. "You'll return to a different seat," Brian replied. "You'll be relocated to the last row of the aircraft near the rear exit. You'll receive no further service from the staff unless in the case of emergency. If you refuse, I have full authority to make an unscheduled landing and remove you." There was a long silence. Charles's nostrils flared, his jaw clenched. Finally, with a forced smile, he said, "Fine, if that's how you run your plane." "It is," Brian said, respectfully and without exception. The move was made quickly. Lucas escorted Dr. Whitaker to the rear row. Ava, from her position, near the curtain, didn't move. She didn't look at him, she didn't have to. The gesture, public, firm, without apology, had already said more than any rebuttal could. As Charles settled into the cramped seat near the lavatories, passengers whispered behind their hands. A man in business class murmured something to his seatmate, and the woman in 2C leaned back with a sigh of relief. The air in the plane felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. Back in the galley, Brian approached Ava. She met his eyes, and for the first time that day, she allowed a sliver of vulnerability to show. "I'm sorry it got to this point," he said quietly. She nodded. "Thank you for stepping in. You shouldn't have to deal with that." "No one should. But especially not you, not today, not on my flight." There was a beat of silence, then she said, "It's not just about today. This kind of thing, it happens more often than people think. Usually it's subtle. But this was targeted." She nodded again. Brian studied her for a moment, then said, "If you want to file a formal complaint, I'll support you. Whatever you decide." Ava didn't answer immediately. For years she had trained herself to let things go, to swallow insults, to move on. But something about this incident, the way it escalated, the way it had been witnessed by so many, made silence feel like surrender. "I'll think about it," she said. The captain gave her a respectful nod, then returned to the cockpit. Ava remained where she was for a while, absorbing the moment. She wasn't entirely sure what she felt. Had relief, exhaustion, maybe even a touch of vindication, but more than anything she felt seen. Not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. As a professional who had been targeted, yes, but also defended. The flight continued, the sun beginning its descent outside the windows. Passengers adjusted their shades, reclined their seats, ordered coffee. But the undercurrent of something significant lingered. In seat 2C, the woman who had spoken up earlier caught Ava's eye when she passed. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not walking away, for holding your head high." Ava didn't reply. She simply gave a quiet nod and continued down the aisle, her steps steady, her spine straight. Something had shifted, yes, not just on this flight, but inside her. A decision was forming, a refusal to stay silent any longer. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed irreversibly. There was no way to pretend otherwise. Even though the confrontation had taken place near the back of the aircraft, whispers had traveled up and down the aisle like a quiet tide. Eyes glanced over shoulders. Phones were lowered mid-scroll. A collective curiosity and tension had taken hold. People sensed that something serious had occurred, and the man now sitting alone in the last row, staring out the window with a jaw locked in anger, was at the center of it. In first class, passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchanges between Ava and Dr. Whitaker were now reassessing what they had seen. What had first seemed like a slightly entitled passenger was now clearly something else entirely. And while some remained silent, not wanting to get involved, others felt the shift as a call to attention. Linda Martinez, a professor of sociology at Stanford, had been observing since the beginning. She had watched Ava handle the man's snide comments with dignity. She had seen the tightening of the young woman's shoulders, the polite neutrality forced into every movement. She knew the signs, the subtle violence of microaggressions, the performance of superiority meant to belittle, and the institutional pressure that kept so many professionals, especially women of color, from speaking up. She waited until Ava returned to the front cabin for routine checks before speaking. "Excuse me," Linda said, stopping her gently. "I just wanted to say, I saw how he was treating you. It was wrong." Ava paused, surprised. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. I don't think everyone realizes how hard it is to keep your composure under that kind of pressure." Ava nodded slowly. "It's part of the job, unfortunately. It shouldn't be." Before Ava could respond, a man across the aisle added, "That guy's been a problem since the beginning. I've flown enough to know when someone's trying to provoke." Another passenger, a young woman with a baby on her lap, turned and said, "I was wondering when someone would say something. I didn't want to be rude, but he crossed a line." Voices began to ripple gently, cautiously, but clearly in Ava's direction. For so long she had felt alone in the discomfort, forced to endure silently while maintaining service with a smile. Now, for the first time, she saw acknowledgement in the eyes of strangers. Linda leaned slightly forward in her seat. "He may think his words didn't leave a mark, but they did. Not just on you, on everyone who heard them." At that moment, a woman from economy, a flight regular whom Ava vaguely recognized, stood and walked up the aisle under the pretense of stretching. As she reached the first-class curtain, she gently stopped Ava. "Hey," the woman said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that a few of us in the back heard about what happened. Someone posted about it already. People are upset. Ava blinked. Posted? Yeah, Twitter, I think. Someone saw him get moved and described what they overheard earlier. People are already picking sides. Ava's stomach tightened. The idea that the situation had left the confines of the aircraft made her uneasy. It was one thing to endure, humiliation in the moment. It was another for that moment to become public property. I didn't ask for attention, she said. I know, the woman replied, but sometimes the attention finds you. As the passenger returned to her seat, Ava resumed her duties, feeling a strange blend of vulnerability and power. Her dignity had been tested publicly, but now that same visibility was becoming a shield, a form of silent support growing all around her. Still, not everyone approved. An older man in 3A, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, muttered something under his breath when Ava passed. This generation is too sensitive, he said, not loud enough to cause a scene, but loud enough for her to hear. She didn't react, but Linda Martinez, sitting just ahead of him, turned around. Actually, she said, what's sensitive is sitting silently while someone is degraded in front of you. The man rolled his eyes and said nothing more. Ava finished her round and returned briefly to the galley to catch her breath. Lucas was there wiping down a tray. They're with you, he said simply. I didn't want any of this, she whispered. I know, but maybe it needed to happen. Just as she was about to respond, the intercom chimed. The captain's voice, calm and steady, came through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter. I want to take a moment to thank you for your cooperation during this flight. I also want to remind everyone that we hold every person on board to the highest standard of conduct. Discrimination, harassment, or disrespect toward any member of our crew or fellow passengers will not be tolerated. Our responsibility is to ensure safety, comfort, and dignity for all. Thank you for understanding. Silence followed. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a smattering of claps. From one row, then another. The sound grew as more passengers joined. It was not raucous or dramatic. It was firm, deliberate. Her recognition of something long overdue. Ava stood frozen in place, her eyes wide. She wasn't someone who sought applause. In fact, she disliked being the center of attention. But this wasn't about her. It was about what had been endured, and what had been witnessed, and now what was being answered. In the last row, Dr. Whitaker stared straight ahead, his arms crossed, his face expressionless. But the flush in his cheeks betrayed the truth. He had lost control of the narrative. And even if he didn't admit it, he knew it. As Ava returned to the aisle, a young girl seated with her father reached out as she passed. "You're really brave," the girl said softly. Ava smiled, touched by the innocence in the child's voice. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching slightly. She continued walking, her steps a little lighter. The respect of her peers mattered. The support of the passengers mattered. But more than anything, what mattered now was the clarity forming inside her. This wasn't just about a single flight or a single insult. It was about the refusal to be small, to be dismissed, to be silenced. Whatever came next, Ava knew this moment would define her in ways she hadn't yet imagined, and she was ready. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm following the captain's announcement, but that calm was deceptive. Underneath the surface, the emotional current continued to run high. Every sound seemed sharper. The clink of a glass, the rustle of a magazine, the hum of the engines. Passengers returned to their routines, but with a new awareness. The mood had shifted from quiet discomfort to collective attention. The lines had been drawn, though unspoken, and in the center of it all, Ava moved with a strange clarity, as if a curtain had been pulled back and nothing would ever look quite the same. She returned to the galley, where Naomi was finishing up her checklist for the next round of service. Lucas was refilling the water bottles for the final beverage run. The three stood together for a brief moment, surrounded by the sterile efficiency of their workspace, trying to make sense of what came next. "Have you spoken to the captain again?" Naomi asked. Ava shook her head. "No. After his announcement, I figured that was it." Lucas glanced down the aisle. "That guy's not going to sit back there quietly. He's already been on his phone non-stop." Ava leaned against the counter, her voice quiet. He's probably messaging his legal team or some board of trustees he serves on. He looks like the type. Naomi added, he knows he's lost the room, but that doesn't mean he won't try to flip the narrative once we land. They all knew it was true. In these situations, perception was currency. And people like Dr. Whitaker had access to more than just money. They had platforms, connections, reputations built over years of carefully cultivated appearances. It wouldn't take much for him to spin this as a case of overreaction, of victimization, of reverse discrimination. The burden of proof, as always, would fall on the one with the least protection. But none of them expected what happened next. Roughly 45 minutes before landing, just as Ava was preparing to assist with the descent checklist, a message came through from the cockpit. It was from Captain Carter, short and direct. Please come to the flight deck, immediately. Ava exchanged glances with Naomi and Lucas, then made her way to the front, heart thudding in her chest. The cockpit door opened for her, and she stepped inside. Brian Carter turned in his seat, Jake glancing over his shoulder as well. Ava, the captain began, his voice calm but firm. I need to ask you something. Off the record, for now. She nodded, unsure what to expect. I've documented everything so far, he continued. The passenger's behavior, your professionalism, the intervention. But there's something I haven't done yet, and I won't unless you approve. Ava blinked. What is it? Brian leaned forward slightly. I'm prepared to file an incident report that will escalate this to our corporate office before we even touch the ground. That includes a preliminary complaint of racial harassment aboard an active flight. It's serious. It will trigger an immediate internal review and possibly involve legal counsel from both sides. She stared at him, absorbing the weight of his words. You're asking me if I want to take this further. I am, but I'm not pushing you. It has to be your call. No pressure, no expectation. But if you say yes, I'll submit it right now. Ava felt the pressure of years, of stories untold, of comments endured, of promotions lost or never offered, of assumptions made in every city, every hotel, every airplane. She thought of every time she had been told to let it go, to stay professional, to not make waves. She thought of the look in Dr. Whitaker's eyes, the entitlement in his voice, the dismissal in every word he'd spoken. She took a breath. Yes, I want to move forward. Brian gave a single nod. Understood. I'll handle the report. You just focus on your duties for the rest of the flight. Ava stepped out of the cockpit a few minutes later, her mind whirring. She had crossed a line now. Not a dangerous one, a necessary one. But there would be consequences. There always were when you chose to speak up. Back in the galley, she relayed what had happened. Lucas and Naomi didn't try to dissuade her. They didn't offer hollow encouragement either. They just stood with her, that was enough. Meanwhile, in the last row of the aircraft, Charles Whitaker was seething. His phone buzzed every few seconds with responses to the messages he had sent. His eyes darted from the screen to the aisle. He had expected to be treated like royalty. Instead, he had been publicly shamed, moved like an unruly child, his authority stripped away in a matter of hours. And now worse, he sensed the whispers were about more than his attitude. He was being painted as a bigot. He could feel it, the weight of public opinion turning against him. He composed a new message, this time to a contact in public relations. Say a strategy firm. He wanted a statement ready, just in case. Something that would frame the incident as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, an unfortunate overreaction. Something that would preserve his image. But while he was preparing defenses, Ava was preparing for truth. At 15 minutes to landing, Captain Carter returned to the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. I want to thank you again for your cooperation today. Before we land, I want to reiterate something important. This crew is here not just for your service, but for your safety. Every member of this team is trained to the highest standard and deserves to work without fear of harassment or disrespect. I hope that today we all remember the value of dignity, for ourselves and for each other. There was no applause this time, just a deep, respectful silence. And it said more than any noise ever could. As the wheels touched down in San Diego, the cabin remained hushed. Passengers gathered their belongings slowly, their movements tinged with reflection. Some nodded at Ava as they passed. Others paused to thank her quietly, not for the coffee or the pretzels, but for something else entirely. Dr. Whitaker disembarked last. No one looked at him. No one offered him the usual parting courtesy. He walked off the plane alone, his steps fast, his eyes fixed forward. Ava remained at the cabin door, standing tall. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was the message, one that would echo far beyond the narrow walls of that airplane. The hum of the airport felt distant as Ava Thompson walked briskly through the terminal at San Diego International. Her uniform, still pressed and pristine, clung to her shoulders with a weight that had nothing to do with fabric. It was the weight of hours spent under scrutiny, the weight of composure stretched to its limits, and now the weight of a choice finally made. The flight had ended, passengers had dispersed, and the aircraft was being cleaned for its next journey. But for Ava, the landing had not brought closure. It had brought ignition. Once inside the crew lounge, she sat alone for a few minutes, her back against the cool vinyl of the bench, her eyes fixed on the patterned carpet. The other attendants had given her space, offering nods of solidarity, but understanding she needed this moment alone. Her phone buzzed once, a message from her supervisor requesting a debrief in the main office before her release. Standard protocol, perhaps, but she knew better than to assume normalcy after what had happened. As she walked toward the administrative wing of the airline offices, her reflection passed in the windows, steady posture, calm expression, but something new behind the eyes, a sharper focus, a resolve that hadn't been there that morning. The hallway was quiet, sterile, filled with the faint echo of distant announcements. At the end of it, behind a frosted glass door, was the room where they'd be waiting. Her supervisor, Karen Delaney, stood when Ava entered. Karen was a woman in her early 50s, tall, angular, with streaks of gray in her tightly pulled back hair. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for neutrality, a policy of maintaining the company's interests without personal involvement. Today, however, her face bore signs of tension. "Ava, come in. Sit down." Ava sat without speaking, folding her hands in her lap. Karen adjusted her reading glasses and looked briefly at a tablet. "I've already spoken to Captain Carter and First Officer Miller. I've also reviewed the report that was transmitted during the flight. This is officially being treated as a critical incident. I need to hear your account in your own words." Ava nodded. For a moment she wasn't sure where to begin, not because she didn't know what happened, but because she had rehearsed this speech in her head for years, for all the moments. She had swallowed indignities, dismissed small slights, and told herself it wasn't worth the trouble. "He targeted me," she began, "from the moment he boarded. The way he spoke to me, the things he said, they weren't about service, they were personal, about my role, my appearance, my competence. And they escalated." Karen listened in silence, her pen moving across a digital notepad. "He questioned whether I belonged there. He made comments about my smile being fake, asked if I was a product of inclusive hiring efforts, refused to accept items I served him, suggested he'd prefer someone more appropriate." Karen looked up. "You believe these were racially motivated?" Ava didn't flinch. "I don't believe, I know. He never said the words directly. He didn't have to. It was in the tone, the implications, the look in his eyes every time he spoke to me. And Captain Carter moved him to the rear. Yes, after multiple warnings and after I confirmed that I was being harassed." Karen tapped her screen once, bringing up another document. "Dr. Whitaker is a known elite-tier passenger, a frequent flyer with a significant history on our routes. There have been no previous complaints filed about him on our system." Ava tilted her head. "That doesn't mean this didn't happen." "I agree. I'm simply stating the facts." There was a pause, and then Karen leaned forward. "Slightly. Do you want to submit a formal grievance, Ava? I need to make this clear. This will become a legal matter. There will be media attention. You may be contacted by investigators, lawyers, and possibly reporters." Ava sat quietly for a beat. Then she said with unmistakable calm, "Yes, I want to file the grievance, and I want it on record that this is not the first time something like this has happened. Maybe not always this blatantly, but this industry allows it to fester, and I'm done pretending it's part of the job." Karen nodded slowly, as if weighing not just Ava's words, but the gravity of what had just been set in motion. "I'll process your request. You'll be contacted by Internal Affairs within 48 hours. As Ava stood to leave, Karen added, "For what it's worth, I believe you." The words, though quietly spoken, carried weight, but Ava wasn't looking for validation. Not anymore. She walked out of the office with her head high, her steps measured, her heart steady. Something irreversible had begun. Outside, the day was beginning to darken. Ava made her way to the parking lot, the warm California air brushing against her skin. She sat in her car for several minutes, thinking. She replayed the flight, the passengers' faces, the captain's voice over the intercom, the way the cabin had fallen silent when she walked past, the child who had called her brave. She unlocked her phone and opened her email. There were already messages from co-workers, some offering support, others asking what happened. Then a new one appeared from a news outlet. They had picked up on a social media thread describing the incident and wanted to know if she'd be willing to comment. She didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, she opened her notes app and began to type. Not for a press release or a legal defense, but for herself. "I've worked hard to earn my place in that uniform, to serve, to protect, to represent my company and my community. I've smiled through storms. I've diffused arguments at 30,000 feet. I've helped terrified children and calmed panicked passengers. And today I was told, without a word spoken directly, that none of that mattered because of the color of my skin. I won't be silent anymore." She stared at the words, then closed the app and started the engine. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew the cost of speaking up. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was clear. This wasn't just a complaint. It was the beginning of something bigger. News traveled fast, faster than Ava could have predicted. Within 24 hours of landing in San Diego, the incident had started to gain traction online. A blurry photo of Dr. Whitaker seated in the last row of the plane, arms crossed and eyes fixed coldly on the window, circulated on Twitter alongside a thread from one of the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. The post recounted the story in broad strokes, emphasizing the passenger's entitled and racist behavior and the elegant composure of the black flight attendant who had stood her ground. Thousands of retweets followed, along with a swarm of comments, some supportive, others predictably dismissive or hostile. Ava had not made any public statements, but her name had started to surface in replies and reposts. Screenshots of her company profile from the airline's internal site began appearing in comment sections. Messages flooded her inbox, many anonymous, some kind, a few hateful. Her social media pages, once reserved for travel photos and quiet updates to close friends, became battlefields of speculation and opinion. In the midst of this digital storm, the airline remained largely silent. A brief internal memo was issued, advising all employees not to comment publicly on ongoing investigations. Ava received a call from Human Resources reiterating the company's commitment to fairness and due process. They thanked her for her professionalism and reminded her to maintain confidentiality. But beneath the corporate language, Ava could sense the tension, the calculation of optics versus loyalty, liability versus principle. Still, she didn't waver. The next morning, Ava reported to the airport for her scheduled shift. The same uniform, the same terminal, the same check-in procedures, but everything felt different. Whispers followed her through the staff lounge. Some colleagues offered her encouraging nods, others avoided her entirely. She was no longer just Ava, the efficient and respected flight attendant. She had become a symbol, and not everyone was comfortable with that. Lucas met her at the gate, his expression guarded. "You good?" She shrugged. "Depends how you define good." They called a special meeting for crew supervisors this morning. I think they're preparing for something bigger. Ava nodded. They should be. Their flight that day was domestic and uneventful. No outbursts, no raised voices, just quiet tension. Ava went through the motions with her usual precision, but there was a weight in her chest she couldn't shake. Each time she greeted a passenger. Each time she walked the aisle, she felt eyes lingering a moment longer than usual. Not always unkind, but curious, as if they were waiting to see how she would move, how she would act, whether she would speak. When they landed, Ava was asked to meet with a representative from the company's internal ethics board. She was taken to a neutral meeting room on the lower floor of the airport office, where a woman named Monica Fields, dressed in a sharp grey suit, greeted her with a calm, measured tone. "Ms. Thompson, I want to begin by thanking you for your cooperation. I know this hasn't been easy." Ava sat down, placing her crew badge on the table. "I didn't do this for gratitude. I just want truth." Monica nodded, flipping open a tablet. "The investigation has officially begun. As part of our process, we're collecting statements from the crew, passengers, and any relevant third parties. I also need to inform you that Dr. Whitaker's legal team has already contacted the company." Of course they have. They're framing the incident as a misunderstanding, claiming he was responding to poor service, that his relocation was excessive, and that he's considering litigation for emotional distress and reputational damage. Ava's laugh was short, humorless. "Emotional distress? From what, you're being held accountable?" "I'm just relaying the facts. However, we've also received positive testimonials from several passengers. Some have submitted written statements. A few have offered to go on record if necessary." That surprised Ava. "They're willing to speak publicly?" "Yes. One of them is a university professor. Another is a corporate executive. Their words carry weight. But more importantly, they're describing a consistent pattern of behavior. Your professionalism stands in stark contrast to his conduct." Ava exhaled slowly. She hadn't asked for champions. She hadn't expected them. And yet, here they were. Voices stepping in where silence once reigned. Monica continued. "We also have surveillance footage from the aircraft cabin. It doesn't have audio, but it clearly shows his repeated use of the call button, your interactions with him, and the captain's intervention." "Then you already have enough evidence." "Evidence isn't always enough. Public perception can influence outcomes, which is why I need to ask you, are you prepared for what comes next?" Ava didn't hesitate. "I am." Back at home, Ava sat on her couch, scrolling through messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, former classmates, even a few strangers from other airlines. Many shared their own stories, some short, some heartbreakingly detailed, about subtle slights, overt discrimination, or the feeling of being invisible in a uniform they had earned. She read each message carefully, responding where she could, saving the rest. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than one flight or one man's cruelty. It was about a pattern, a culture, a system that allowed certain people to believe they could mistreat others without consequence. That evening, her phone rang. It was Captain Carter. "Just checking in," he said. "Wanted to see how you're holding up." "I'm tired," she admitted, "but I'm still here. You did the right thing, Ava. No matter how loud the noise gets, you were right." "Thank you, Captain." He paused. "You know, in all my years of flying, I've seen a lot. But the way you handled that man, the way you held your ground without ever raising your voice, that's something I won't forget." Neither would she. As the call ended, Ava opened her laptop. She began to draft a statement, not for the press, not for legal teams, but for herself. A record of what happened, her voice unfiltered. She didn't know yet if she would share it publicly, but she knew she needed to write it down. The truth mattered. Her story mattered. And for the first time, she wasn't just surviving the turbulence. She was rising through it. The echo of her decision had barely begun to settle when Ava received a message that would change the course of everything once again. It came 2 days after her interview with Monica Fields, just as she was preparing for another scheduled flight. The message was from her supervisor, Karen Delaney. But this time, the tone was different. "Ava, please report to the corporate office immediately after your next flight. There's a matter requiring your attention, confidential." It was brief, even by corporate standards. No explanation, no courtesy fluff, just a direct summons. Ava stared at it for a few moments before tucking her phone away. She had learned to stop expecting transparency from people who feared what the truth might reveal. The flight to Denver was uneventful. Her colleagues offered quiet support, but the energy in the crew room was different now. Ava could feel it, a mixture of respect and unease. She was no longer just Ava the attendant. She had become something more complex, a living reminder that silence was no longer the only option. After landing, she changed out of her uniform and made her way to the corporate wing, where the sterile decor and impersonal lighting felt more intimidating than ever. The receptionist, who usually greeted her by name, avoided eye contact and gestured toward a side conference room. Ava entered slowly, unsure of what to expect. Inside, Karen was already seated at the table, along with two unfamiliar individuals, one man in a charcoal suit with a tablet open before him, and a woman with short cropped hair and an unreadable expression. They introduced themselves as part of the airline's legal and compliance division. "Ava," Karen began, "thank you for coming. What we're about to share with you is confidential and part of an internal investigation." Ava nodded once. Her heartbeat remained steady. The man in the suit took over. "We have continued reviewing Dr. Whitaker's history as a passenger, including feedback, complaints, and internal notes across multiple divisions. What we've uncovered is concerning." He tapped a button on the tablet, pulling up a series of entries. Although none of these were formally filed as grievances, there are recurring mentions of unpleasant behavior, hostile tone, and dismissive conduct, especially toward female crew members. The woman beside him added, "In particular, we've identified 3 separate incidents involving black female staff, 2 flight attendants, and 1 gate agent. Each of them documented interactions with Dr. Whitaker that, while subtle, followed a strikingly similar pattern to what you described. Belittling language, frequent complaints, tone policing, questioning competence." Ava felt her pulse quicken. Why were none of these pursued? Several of the employees involved chose not to escalate. Some were contract staff, some feared repercussions. At the time, without a formal complaint or witness testimony, the company took no disciplinary action. "But now that I've filed one," Ava said, voice low but firm, "it's different." Karen leaned forward. "Yes. Your documentation, combined with the other accounts and the captain's in-flight report, has opened a formal review of Dr. Whitaker's passenger privileges. Additionally, his name has been flagged in our system pending the outcome of a larger investigation." Ava looked from one face to another. "So what does that mean, exactly?" The legal representative hesitated before answering. "It means he may be added to the airline's internal watch list, pending the results of an external ethics committee's findings. And depending on the scope of that outcome, he could be banned from flying with our company." The words sank in slowly. For years she had told herself that reporting someone like him would lead nowhere, that power would protect him, that institutions would always prioritize prestige over justice. But here it was, a crack in the system. Small, yes, but real. Karen spoke again. "There's more." Ava braced herself. After the story began circulating on social media, an anonymous tip was submitted to our ethics hotline. The caller claimed to be a former hospital administrator from a private clinic in Los Angeles. She stated that Dr. Whitaker had previously been investigated for misconduct involving junior staff members, most of them women of color. A chill moved down Ava's spine. While that case was handled privately by the hospital and records are sealed, the allegations were serious enough to have prompted internal hearings. According to the tip, several employees left the institution shortly afterward. Ava exhaled. And yet he kept practicing, flying, living like none of it happened. "That's unfortunately common," the compliance officer replied. "But what's uncommon is someone like you taking it this far and having enough documented support to hold him accountable." The room fell silent for a moment. "We're not asking you to take on more than you already have," Karen said, her voice more cautious now. But we do want you to know that your testimony is going to play a central role in the proceedings. This isn't just a grievance anymore. It's part of a much wider examination. Ava stood slowly, absorbing everything. I understand, and I'll cooperate. Outside the building, the sky was beginning to cloud over. Ava walked to her car, opened the door, and sat without turning the ignition. Her hands rested on the steering wheel as she stared ahead. This was no longer just about a flight or even a company. This was about something systemic, hidden behind titles and diplomas, concealed beneath tailored suits and measured tones. It was about the quiet permission the world gave to certain men to behave without consequence, and the heavy silence expected from the women they undermined. Ava opened her phone again. Another message had come in, this time from one of the flight attendants referenced in the internal files. The woman, whose name was Leah, had seen Ava's story on a closed professional forum. She wrote, "I never reported him. I thought no one would believe me. I'm so sorry you had to go through it too, but I'm grateful you spoke up. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Ava typed a reply, her fingers steady. "Thank you, Leah. I think this is just the beginning." And she meant it. Ava sat before the panel, the buzz of the overhead lights forming a low, constant hum above her. The conference room was stark, clinical, filled with the dull grays and whites of corporate neutrality. Across from her, 4 individuals represented different branches of the airline's senior leadership: human resources, legal, public relations, and flight operations. Each of them had a digital tablet or notepad in front of them, styluses. "Ready?" Expressions composed with the same practiced indifference she had learned to read from years in the sky. This was not a disciplinary hearing, nor was it a trial, but the room carried the gravity of both. Ava was not on trial for wrongdoing. She was a witness, a complainant, and now, inadvertently, a symbol. But she could feel the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders like a lead vest, not because she was afraid, but because she understood the stakes. "We've reviewed your formal complaint, Ms. Thompson," the HR representative began, his voice even, "and we want to acknowledge the seriousness of your claims. This meeting is part of our expanded internal inquiry into the incident aboard Flight 227, as well as related allegations now emerging about the same passenger. You're not under any obligation to respond beyond what you've already submitted. That said, we value your willingness to participate in this process." Ava nodded once. "I understand." The legal officer spoke next. "You've already given 2 formal interviews to our internal compliance division. Today's meeting is to help the executive team understand how this issue fits into a broader pattern, not just with one passenger, but with our procedures, our training, and our culture." Ava studied each face in front of her. Some seemed genuinely engaged. Others, particularly the woman from public relations, looked as though they were already formulating damage control strategies. "I've worked here for 8 years, Ava began, voice calm but unwavering. "I've flown hundreds of routes with thousands of passengers. I've been harassed before, I've been insulted. Most times I kept quiet because I didn't want to be labeled difficult or emotional or worse, problematic." She paused, letting the silence settle. No one interrupted. But what happened on that flight wasn't just a bad interaction. It wasn't just a rude passenger having a bad day. It was targeted, it was calculated. He didn't want better service, he wanted to put me in my place. A flicker of discomfort passed through the public relations officer's face. "And what's worse," Ava continued, "is that he wasn't the first. Maybe he was more obvious, more brazen, but he wasn't the first to treat me like I didn't belong in my own uniform." The operations officer leaned forward slightly. "Are you saying there's a broader issue within our passenger community?" Ava gave a short nod. "Not just passengers. There's a culture of tolerance, not on paper, but in practice. We're told to be professional, to de-escalate, to endure. And that's fine when we're talking about spilled drinks or gate delays, but not when we're being dehumanized." She shifted slightly in her seat, eyes steady. "The only reason this was taken seriously is because it was public, because someone tweeted, because it made noise. If I'd filed the same report with no witnesses and no social media thread, I know exactly what would have happened. Nothing. The legal officer didn't deny it. "We are reviewing how past reports were handled, particularly those involving the same passenger." "You should be," Ava replied, "but you also need to look at how your people are trained, not just to pour drinks and explain safety protocols, but to recognize and respond to abuse. We're taught how to save lives in an emergency, but when it comes to protecting our dignity, we're on our own." The HR representative clicked his stylus twice, thoughtful. "Would you be willing to participate in a broader review process? Potentially help shape some of the new training modules we're developing?" Ava didn't answer immediately. She wasn't looking for a spotlight, but she also knew this wasn't just about her anymore. "I would," she said finally, "but not as a face on a slideshow. I want to be in the room when decisions are made. I want to make sure the next black woman who files a complaint doesn't have to go viral just to be believed." A brief silence followed her words. It was not hostile, more like the quiet that follows a difficult truth finally spoken aloud. After the meeting, Ava was escorted to a quieter office where Monica Fields was waiting. The compliance officer stood when Ava entered and offered a subdued smile. "You handled that exactly right." "I wasn't sure I did." "You did. They needed to hear it like that." Monica handed Ava a folder. "There's something else. Off the record for now. Dr. Whitaker's medical license is under review. The board received an anonymous tip that included several prior incidents. Your report was included in the packet." Ava raised an eyebrow. "So he might lose his license?" "It's possible. These things move slowly, but the momentum is shifting." Ava sat down, absorbing the information. For so long she had assumed men like him were immune, protected by their degrees, their positions, their wealth. But now the cracks were widening. Later that night, Ava returned to her apartment and sat on her small balcony overlooking the quiet street. Her phone buzzed constantly with alerts she had stopped checking. Instead, she opened a fresh page in her notebook and began to write. Not for publication, not for a legal case, just for herself. She wrote about the loneliness of being the only one who looks like you in the room, about the way people weaponize politeness to mask cruelty, about the strength it takes to hold your posture when everything in you wants to collapse, and about the quiet defiance of saying, "This is not okay," and meaning it. She didn't know how long the process would take. She didn't know what the final outcome would be. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was navigating the storm alone. And that made all the difference. 6 months had passed since the flight that altered the trajectory of Ava Thompson's life. In that time, the story that had once simmered within the walls of a Boeing aircraft had evolved into a national conversation. It no longer belonged solely to Ava, or even to the airline. It had expanded beyond her, into the media, into academic institutions, into training programs and employee rights campaigns. Her voice, steady, thoughtful, unwilling to be softened, had become a catalyst. But Ava had not sought celebrity. She avoided interviews unless they served a greater purpose. She turned down invitations to sit on daytime talk shows and refused lucrative offers to sell her story to entertainment companies. Her integrity was not for auction. What she accepted instead were roles that could influence change from within. The airline, responding to the mounting public scrutiny and internal pressure, launched an initiative titled Airspace for All. It was more than a branding effort. It was a public commitment to transform how the company handled bias, harassment, and systemic inequity. And at the center of that initiative stood Ava, not as a token, but as a collaborator. She was appointed to a newly formed position, Lead Advisor for Inclusive Flight Operations. It was a title that didn't exist before her, and one that came with more responsibility than status. Her role included consulting on new training protocols, leading workshops for flight crews and management, and reviewing passenger conduct policies with a team of diversity consultants. At first, some colleagues were skeptical. Whispers followed, heard down the halls of headquarters. People questioned her qualifications, suggesting she was promoted because of optics. Ava, ever composed, never addressed those insinuations directly. She let her work answer them, She restructured the internal bias training from a dry online module into a series of real-world scenario workshops. She introduced anonymous reporting, tools for cabin crew, allowing them to safely document inappropriate passenger behavior. She pushed for mandatory debriefings after critical incidents and advocated for post-incident care, including mental health resources. Slowly, the culture began to shift. Meanwhile, the outcome of the investigation into Dr. Charles Whitaker was made public. The State Medical Board suspended his license pending a full disciplinary hearing. The hospital where he practiced released a statement confirming they were cooperating with the review process. Several former staff members came forward anonymously to share stories of verbal harassment and professional manipulation. Though no single event ended his career, the accumulation of his actions, amplified by Ava's decision to speak out, had created a reckoning. The day the board's suspension was announced, Ava sat alone in her office staring at the press release forwarded by Monica Fields. There was no joy in the headline, no sense of triumph, just a quiet satisfaction that came with knowing the system for once had not looked away. That afternoon, Ava met with a group of new hires, flight attendants who had recently completed training and were preparing for their first rotations. She watched as they sat in the small orientation room, fidgeting with their new badges and reviewing emergency protocols. When she entered, they straightened slightly, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You don't need me to tell you what this job demands," Ava said, standing at the front of the room. "You've already been tested. You've studied, drilled, and proven yourselves capable. But there's one part of this job they don't always tell you about." She paused, scanning the room. "It's not just about knowing where the oxygen masks are or how to guide a plane full of strangers through turbulence. It's about knowing how to protect yourself and each other when dignity is threatened." One of the new attendants, a young woman with dark braids and bright eyes, raised her hand. "Is it true you challenged the passenger who got banned?" Ava offered a small smile. "I didn't challenge him, I held him accountable." Another hand went up. "How did you know they'd listen to you?" "I didn't," Ava answered, "but I knew I had to speak anyway." After the session, several trainees approached her, asking questions, thanking her, sharing their own fears and hopes. Ava listened to each one. It reminded her of the loneliness she used to carry, the silence she had worn like armor. Now that silence had been broken. Later that week, Ava received an invitation to speak at a national aviation conference in Washington, D.C. The event focused on ethics, leadership, and workforce equity. She agreed to attend on one condition: she would not give a keynote. She wanted a panel shared with other crew members from different backgrounds, people whose stories had never made headlines. The panel was standing room only. Ava sat between a former pilot who had spoken out against gender discrimination and a ground agent who had sued for disability accommodations. Together, they shared stories not of revenge, but of resistance. Not of victimhood, but of resilience. When it was Ava's turn to speak, she kept it simple. "I was trained to follow procedures, but when someone tried to erase my worth mid-air, no procedure could prepare me for that. I had to decide whether silence was safer, or whether speaking was the only way forward." The room held its breath. "I chose to speak, and I'm still speaking, because the moment we stop, the moment we go quiet, is the moment they win." Afterward, a journalist approached her with a recorder. "Do you think the system has changed?" Ava looked past her, toward the crowd of professionals still mingling in the auditorium. "I think the system blinked. Now we have to make sure it opens its eyes." She left the conference with no entourage, no fanfare, just a notebook full of names and emails from people who had thanked her for showing that justice, even when delayed, was still possible. That night, back in her hotel room, Ava opened her laptop and read the latest email from Monica. It included a draft of a policy amendment they were planning to implement, one that would permanently empower crew members to report passengers for misconduct without managerial approval. Her recommendations were in every line. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she sat by the window looking down at the city lights flickering like distant constellations. This was never what she planned for, but sometimes change doesn't ask permission. It just takes a voice willing to rise above the noise. It began quietly, in places far from airport terminals and executive boardrooms. University classrooms, staff lounges, corporate HR departments, even small community gatherings, all began referencing the incident not by name, but by example. What happened to the flight attendant, they would say, or the San Diego flight situation? People remembered not just the conflict, but the poise, not just the insult, but the refusal to be silent. And as the story made its way through these spaces, it took on a life that was no longer just Ava's. It belonged to anyone who had ever sat in silence while enduring injustice and had finally seen what could happen when someone said no. Ava was invited to speak not just at aviation conferences, but at diversity panels in universities, corporate leadership seminars, public sector workshops, and grassroots equity campaigns. She accepted some, declined others, choosing carefully where she would lend her voice. She didn't want applause, she wanted action. She wanted structural change, policy shifts, cultural re-evaluation, and she wanted those things to outlive her story. At Stanford, a professor who had seen her panel in DC invited her to join a symposium on ethics and systemic power. During her session, she posed a question to a room filled with future lawyers and policymakers. "How many microaggressions does it take before you stop calling it micro?" she asked. "What if every small offense is just one stone in a very large wall designed to keep people out?" The room was quiet, then filled with nods. She didn't speak of trauma. She spoke of patterns, of structure, of how institutions, not just people, sustain environments where some are allowed to belittle and others are trained to absorb. A few weeks later, she was approached by a large multinational company looking to overhaul their internal bias training. They offered her a consulting role. She agreed, but only after insisting that their senior leadership complete the program first, alongside their newest interns. Equality, she said, must be practiced at every level. In each new room she entered, Ava never claimed expertise she hadn't earned. She made clear that she wasn't a sociologist, wasn't a lawyer, wasn't an activist by design. She was a flight attendant who had been forced to confront something larger than any single flight. And because she hadn't turned away, the story had grown. Meanwhile, within the airline industry, ripple effects were becoming waves. Other flight attendants began sharing their experiences more openly. A private forum for aviation professionals turned into a moderated network for reporting patterns of abuse. The airline that employed Ava wasn't the only one impacted. Competitors began reviewing their own protocols, quietly making changes before facing public scrutiny themselves. Ava's airline introduced a new initiative, Listen First. It emphasized early intervention, clear communication, and non-retaliation protections for crew who reported mistreatment. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't revolutionary, but it was real. And for the first time in her career, Ava saw something shift not out of fear, but out of conscience. One particularly impactful moment came during a regional diversity summit in Atlanta. Ava was asked to open the event. Instead of a speech, she read a short letter written by a junior flight attendant only 2 months into the job who had reached out to her privately. In the letter, the young woman described how she had almost quit after a passenger made repeated comments about her hair, her tone, and her attitude. She had stayed silent. But after hearing Ava speak, she had filed a report, not to punish, but to be heard. She ended her note with the words, "You gave me permission to take up space." When Ava finished reading, the room was still. There was no applause, just a moment of collective understanding, a shared awareness that power, when used with intention and clarity, could be contagious. Outside the formal spotlight, Ava remained intentional with her boundaries. She still worked flights, though fewer. She chose routes where she could mentor newer crew members. When colleagues asked why she hadn't transitioned entirely into corporate or advocacy work, she would simply say, "I still love to fly." And she did. The sky to her remained a place of freedom, not from the world but above its noise. When she was in the air, she wasn't a headline or a case study. She was a professional doing what she had trained to do, helping people, keeping them safe, moving them from one place to another with care and precision. But even in the air, the impact of her decision echoed. On one flight to Chicago, A middle-aged passenger passed her in the aisle, paused and said, "You're Ava, right?" She gave a careful nod. "I just want to say thank you for not backing down." He didn't linger. He didn't ask for a photo. He just returned to his seat and opened a book, but the moment stayed with her. On another flight, a teenage girl handed her a folded piece of paper when disembarking. Inside was a drawing of Ava in her uniform, standing tall, with a caption that read, "She stood up so others could sit down." These small gestures, quiet, human, uncalculated, meant more to her than any speech or panel. Change, Ava knew, didn't come in grand declarations. It came in accumulation, in repeated choices, in thousands of people learning to see what they had once ignored. It came in the courage to raise a voice, not once but as many times as it took. She kept every note, every message in a box at home, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder that even in turbulence, even when the sky feels heavy, one voice can steady a plane, one truth can shift the course, and one woman, choosing not to shrink, can leave behind something far greater than a story. She can leave a path. 1 year had passed since Flight 227 took off from New York and landed in San Diego, under circumstances that would echo far beyond that day. In that time, the world had moved on to new stories, new controversies, and new headlines. But for Ava Thompson, everything had changed, not in a loud, dramatic explosion of transformation, but through a steady unfolding of purpose. She woke that morning at 5 o'clock, not out of necessity but by habit. The air outside was still dark, the sky somewhere between midnight and dawn. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that always felt sacred to her, not empty but full of possibility. She stood at her window for a moment before dressing. Her uniform lay prepared as always, freshly pressed, every crease intentional. The navy blue jacket, the polished shoes, the simple silver wings on her chest, none of it had changed. But she had. Today's flight would mirror the one that changed her life. New York to San Diego. Same route, same time, same altitude. But everything else was different. Ava arrived at the airport just before 6 o'clock. The terminal buzzed with early morning travelers, all in various states of drowsy motion, coffee in hand, eyes scanning departure. Boards, families juggling children and luggage. It was a scene she had known 1,000 times, yet today she moved through it with a kind of grounded grace, like someone who had returned to a familiar stage, but with a new script. Her crew greeted her with smiles, some new faces, some familiar. She was no longer just part of the team. She was the lead flight supervisor, with authority not only over the in-flight experience, but also as a representative of the airline's revised code of conduct, built partially from the very conflict she had endured. At the gate, as boarding began, Ava took her position near the aircraft door. One by one, passengers filed in. Business people, students, retirees, parents with restless toddlers. She greeted each with warmth and clarity, eyes meeting theirs not out of obligation, but because presence had become her power. Midway through boarding, a woman paused at the door. She was in her 50s, with soft eyes and salt and pepper hair. She held a paperback novel in one hand and a travel tote in the other. "You're Ava Thompson, aren't you?" the woman asked. Ava nodded gently. "Yes, I am. I just wanted to say thank you. I wasn't on that flight, but I followed everything that happened. You reminded people like me that our silence doesn't have to be forever." Ava didn't speak for a moment. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been lived. She simply smiled, then gestured to the aisle. "Have a safe and comfortable flight, ma'am." As the woman passed, Ava turned to watch the rest of the boarding process. The aircraft filled, the overhead bins closed, the engines prepared, and once the final checks were complete, she walked down the aisle one last time before takeoff, scanning every seat, every passenger, every moment. Once airborne, Ava remained in motion, helping with service, coordinating with the cockpit, assisting passengers, answering questions. But now each action felt charged with something deeper than routine. She was no longer performing the role of a flight attendant. She was inhabiting it, with ownership, with authority, with history behind every step. During the beverage service, a teenage girl seated in row 15 tapped Ava's arm. "Excuse me," she said. "My mum told me about you. She said you're the reason she finally reported her boss." Ava blinked. "That's very kind of her." The girl shrugged. "She said she didn't think anyone would care until she read your story. She keeps your picture saved on her phone." Ava reached for a cup of water and handed it to the girl. "Tell her I said thank you. And that I'm proud of her." At cruising altitude, Ava allowed herself a moment to sit. She looked out the window. The clouds rolled by below them in soft, endless waves. The sun caught the wing of the aircraft just right, reflecting a streak of gold across the sky. She had always loved this part of the flight. The stillness, the height, the perspective. She remembered the moment 1 year ago when she had almost walked away, when she had told herself it wasn't worth the fight, when she had nearly convinced herself that being quiet would be easier. But then she remembered the way Charles Whitaker looked at her, spoke to her, tried to strip her of her identity with nothing more than a tone and a title. And she remembered the moment she chose deliberately not to accept it. She had not won a war that day. She had not overturned centuries of injustice, but she had done what was hers to do. She had stood in the small, powerful space between humiliation and dignity, and she had chosen herself. Upon landing in San Diego, Ava stood once more at the cabin door, thanking passengers as they exited. Most moved quickly, eager to reach their connections or baggage claims. But one young woman stopped, lingered, then stepped closer. "I don't want to take your time," she said softly, "but I just wanted to say that flight, the one last year, it meant something to me. It made me feel seen." Ava placed a hand lightly over her chest. "Then it was worth it." After the last passenger had left, Ava remained for a moment in the quiet cabin. She looked down the empty aisle, the stillness of the seats, the way the light fell across the floor. Then she walked slowly to her jump seat, removed her badge, and held it for a long moment in her hands. The flight that had once been a wound had become a testament, a line in history written not by outrage but by insistence, on truth, on decency, on belonging. And as Ava stepped off the aircraft, the air felt warmer, the sky clearer, and her stride firmer than ever. She was no longer just the woman from Flight 227. She was the woman who had dared to speak when silence was the easier path. She was the woman who stayed in the air, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And in that choice, she had lifted more than herself. She had lifted a movement. She had lifted a voice. And somewhere in every airport, in every cabin, in every uniformed heart quietly hoping for change, Ava Thompson had become a name that meant, keep going.